The aftermath of emancipation and how Louisiana's sugar plantations resisted real freedom. In 1865, when slavery was officially abolished in the United States, many believed the chains had been broken forever. Yet the story was different in Louisiana, especially near Baton Rouge. Sugar was the backbone of the local economy, and plantation owners were not ready to give up the cheap labor they had controlled for generations. By the early 1900s, black families who had once worked as enslaved laborers found themselves trapped in a cycle of false promises. Freedom on paper did not mean freedom in practice. To keep the workforce tied to the land, former enslavers quickly created systems. Contracts were written in ways most freedmen could not read or understand, and debts were invented to bind them back to the fields. Surrounded by fertile sugarcane lands, Baton Rouge became a place where the old ways quietly survived. Using the same language of the antebellum South, planters openly talked about needing discipline to manage black workers. With stubbornness, the plantations resisted change, and violence was often used against those who demanded better treatment. This was the hidden continuation of slavery, disguised under new names but keeping the same cruel essence alive for decades. The rise of debt peonage and convict leasing after Reconstruction near Baton Rouge. By the late 19th century and into the early decades of the 20th, Louisiana had perfected new methods to keep black men and women under control. One of them was debt peonage. Sharecroppers working sugar near Baton Rouge were given credit for tools, food, and housing, but the debts were impossible to repay. Year after year, the books always showed that the worker owed more than he had earned. This trap made leaving impossible. At the same time, through the convict leasing system, the state itself became a partner in exploitation. Harsh vagrancy laws were enforced by local police and sheriffs in East Baton Rouge Parish. If a black man was found without proof of employment, he could be arrested, fined, and then leased to the very same plantations he had tried to escape. In chains, the men were forced to work, cutting cane under the burning Louisiana sun, guarded by overseers with rifles. Even as America faced the Great Depression in 1932, this system was still thriving. For the sugar elites, convict labor meant profit. For black communities, it meant terror, knowing that at any moment a family member could be snatched, accused of a crime, and sent back into bondage. In all but name, it was slavery. Local sheriffs enforcing vagrancy laws to capture black men for plantation labor. In the Louisiana of the early 1930s, sheriffs and deputies were not neutral officers of the law. In East Baton Rouge Parish, law enforcement often worked hand in hand with plantation owners. A weapon was used in the form of vagrancy laws written to criminalize poverty. If a black man was found walking without proof of employment, or if he lingered near the railroad stations of Baton Rouge, he risked arrest. These arrests were rarely about crime. They were about labor. Fines that few could pay were imposed by the courts, controlled by white elites. Within days, these men were leased out to sugar plantations. Shackled in groups, they were taken into the cane fields where overseers treated them as expendable bodies. By enforcing this system, local sheriffs grew powerful, often receiving payments from plantation barons in exchange for a steady supply of workers. The community understood the danger. Simply traveling to visit relatives or looking for seasonal work could end in a sentence of months or years on a plantation chain gang. Near the banks of the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, stories circulated of men who never returned once arrested. Families were broken and mothers begged sons not to wander far. Instead of offering protection, law enforcement became an extension of slavery's whip, keeping fear alive long after abolition had been declared. The economic power of sugar barons in Louisiana during the early 1900s. By 1932, sugar remained the lifeblood of Louisiana's economy. Dominated by vast plantations, the fields stretching from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, and behind them stood the sugar barons. These were wealthy white families who had inherited land, political influence, and the machinery of exploitation from their ancestors. Their wealth gave them control over local banks, newspapers, and even courts. The sugar industry provided jobs and revenue, but it also demanded the submission of thousands of black workers who were kept poor and powerless. In Baton Rouge, the barons financed political campaigns, ensuring that governors and legislators defended their interests. When federal investigators arrived in Louisiana during the 1920s to look into forced labor, the sugar elites pushed back, arguing that their system was tradition. They sponsored community events, parades, and even church donations, painting themselves as benefactors, while behind closed gates, men worked in chains. Not just local was the economic power of these planters. It connected to national corporations and sugar refineries along the Mississippi River. Their profits depended on cheap labor, and so every sheriff, judge, and politician who supported them ensured the cycle of oppression continued. In the midst of the Great Depression, when many in America suffered unemployment, the sugar barons of Louisiana still maintained their fortune. Built on the backs of black laborers denied freedom for generations. Daily life of chained workers, harsh discipline, overcrowded barracks, and endless fields. For those trapped on sugar plantations near Baton Rouge in the early 1930s, daily life was a nightmare that never seemed to end. Often still chained together in groups, men woke before sunrise and were forced into the fields while the morning mist clung to the cane. Raw from the iron shackles, their ankles rubbed, making each step painful. Yet stopping was not an option. Overseers demanded that rows of cane be cut quickly, threatening beatings if the pace slowed. Barely enough to survive were meals. Cornmeal, beans, or scraps thrown into wooden bowls. Water was carried in barrels, lukewarm and scarce. At night, workers returned to crowded barracks, wooden shacks with dirt floors, no bedding, and little air circulation in the humid Louisiana heat. Easily from skin infections to respiratory sickness, disease spread, and medical help was non-existent. The rattling of chains and the moans of exhausted men broke sleep. Families were not allowed to visit, and letters were rare. Workers lived with the constant knowledge that escape attempts usually ended in capture and brutal punishment. For many, the sugar fields became a prison without walls, where days blended together into endless cycles of labor, pain, and despair. From one sunrise to the next, life itself was reduced to survival. The role of guards and overseers in maintaining a system of slavery in disguise. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. Behind the continuation of slavery on Louisiana sugar plantations stood the guards and overseers. These men acted as the iron fist of the sugar barons, enforcing discipline with guns, whips, and intimidation. In the Baton Rouge area, overseers rode on horseback along the rows of cane, watching every movement of the chained workers. If someone slowed down, stumbled, or refused to follow orders, punishment was immediate. Whippings were carried out in front of others to spread fear, and some men were left bleeding in the fields as warnings. Often recruited from poor white communities, guards were men given authority and paid to keep order. Their loyalty was bought with wages, alcohol, and the promise of social superiority over black workers. They carried rifles slung across their shoulders, ready to fire on anyone attempting to run. Stories circulated of men who were caught after fleeing, dragged back with chains heavier than before. Overseers controlled every hour of the day, from dawn roll calls to night checks in the barracks. The system depended on their cruelty, because without constant threats, the forced labor would collapse. In truth, they were the visible reminder that emancipation had not brought freedom. For those trapped in the cane fields, the sight of a guard on horseback was enough to crush hope, reinforcing that the plantation was still a place of bondage even in 1932. Stories of families torn apart with men forced into labor camps and women left behind. One of the most devastating parts of this hidden slavery in Louisiana was the way it tore families apart. In the countryside around Baton Rouge, black families struggled to hold on to stability, but the system of vagrancy laws and convict leasing constantly stole fathers, brothers, and sons. To look for seasonal work or to buy supplies in town, a man might leave his home, only to be arrested under vague charges like loitering or disturbing the peace. Within days, he could be chained and sent to a sugar plantation, leaving behind a wife and children with no income, no protection, and no explanation. Forced to raise families alone, women often took in laundry, cooked for white households, or relied on church communities to survive. Children grew up watching their fathers vanish, sometimes returning years later, broken by labor, sometimes never returning at all. In Baton Rouge, entire neighborhoods of black families lived under the shadow of this fear, never knowing who would be taken next. Family reunions, weddings, or funerals were risky occasions because sheriffs often prowled gatherings looking for men to arrest. From generation to generation, these stories passed, whispered at night, or told in church meetings, carrying the memory of pain and resilience. The tearing apart of families was not only a personal tragedy. It was a deliberate tool of control. By separating men from their loved ones, the system weakened entire communities, ensuring that the cycle of dependence and fear would continue. Federal government investigations in the 1920s and early 1930s. Despite the secrecy of plantation life, whispers of abuse reached beyond Louisiana. In the 1920s, the federal government began receiving complaints about forced labor and men being held in chains. Long after the Civil War had ended, investigators were sent to southern states, including Louisiana, where they found shocking evidence. Men shackled in groups, overseers carrying rifles, and entire camps operating as if emancipation had never occurred. Near Baton Rouge, reports described fields of cane filled with laborers unable to leave, guarded day and night. These findings caused outrage in Washington. But the political power of the sugar barons created obstacles. Local officials denied the accusations, claiming that workers were volunteers or that they were simply paying off debts. Plantation owners used their wealth to pressure state authorities and to dismiss federal concerns. Still, investigators documented case after case, noting the chains, the whippings, and the overcrowded barracks where men slept on the ground. By 1932, during the Great Depression, these investigations became more urgent as forced labor was exposed not only as a human rights abuse, but also as a system that undercut free workers struggling to find jobs. The revelations shocked Northern audiences who believed slavery had ended 70 years earlier. Yet for the black communities of Louisiana, it was not a revelation. It was daily reality. These investigations planted seeds of change, but for many men still trapped on plantations near Baton Rouge, the reports were only words on paper while their chains remained locked. The case of Baton Rouge plantations in 1932, evidence of men still chained in the fields. In 1932, the reality of slavery's persistence in Louisiana could no longer be hidden. Near Baton Rouge, federal investigators and journalists uncovered shocking evidence. Black men still chained together, working under the scorching Louisiana sun as if the year were 1832 rather than 1932. These men were not criminals in any meaningful sense. Most had been arrested for minor charges like vagrancy or failure to show proof of employment. Once sentenced, they were handed over to plantation owners who locked iron shackles around their ankles and forced them into endless rows of sugarcane. Witnesses described lines of workers marching in chains, guarded by armed overseers on horseback. The sound of metal scraping against the dirt became part of the daily rhythm of the fields. Newspapers in the North published stories about these discoveries, causing outrage among readers who had believed slavery was long gone. But in Louisiana, the reaction was mixed. Some white residents defended the system as necessary for the survival of the sugar economy, while black families quietly whispered, "We already knew." The year 1932 stood as undeniable proof that slavery had not truly ended in the Deep South. It had merely changed its name and its disguise. For the men trapped in those chains, freedom was still a distant dream. The slow decline of these practices leading into the civil rights activism that followed. The system of forced labor in Louisiana did not collapse overnight. Even after the revelations of 1932, sugar barons and their allies in politics resisted change. It took years of pressure from federal investigations, northern newspapers, and courageous local voices for the chains to finally loosen. Slowly through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the practice of convict leasing and open peonage began to decline, but the scars it left on Baton Rouge's black community remained deep. Families who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons carried their grief into the next generation. Churches became safe havens where stories were preserved, and schools tried to teach children that freedom was worth fighting for even if it had been denied to their parents. By the 1950s, as the civil rights movement began to grow, survivors of these sugar plantations told their stories to younger activists. They reminded them that slavery had not ended with Lincoln's proclamation, but had lived on in hidden fields only a few miles from the state capital. These memories fueled the determination of a new generation to demand justice, equality, and dignity. The slow decline of forced labor in Baton Rouge was not simply a historical process. It was the foundation on which the civil rights struggle was built. Out of the chains of 1932 came the voices that would later march, protest, and refuse to be silenced.